other general biology too. We finished up plants, but I wanted to include a little backyard ecology for our first lecture on fungus. I don't keep fungus in my house, but I have a lot growing in my backyard, so I thought I'd show you some. This right here is my favorite piece of fungus that's in my backyard. Is this gorgeous piece of lichen that I try not to disturb because I think it's really pretty. It's growing on these stone steps that I have in my backyard. And you very easily could probably find some around your house too if you wanted to. You might not think this is a fungus, but it is. It's a symbiosis between fungi, algae, and sometimes cyanobacteria, and we're going to talk about that in today's lecture. So let's get to it. Okay, let's talk about fungi. First, let's go a little bit through fungal classification and the different types of fungi. A person who studies fungi is called a mycologist, M-Y-C-O, mycologist. And there are generally accepted 4 general classes of fungi, and those are in the table here. One of the first ones is the Chytridomycota. These are aquatic flagellate fungi, and they're primarily known as parasites on aquatic and amphibious animals. So some of you may have heard of chytrid fungus. It's this really terrible invasive fungal infection that is killing a lot of amphibian populations. That is a chytrid mycota. There's also the Zygomycota. The Zygomycota are the most common type of the bread molds. This class can be identified by their ability to undergo sexual reproduction, and we'll see that this process is much different than sexual reproduction in animals and plants. We'll talk about that in a second. There's also the Basidiomycota that are right here. No, right here. Those little tiny words. There's the Basidiomycota. This group's, you can recognize them by the formation of a cap or a club or a basidium as the reproductive body. And then this class is most recognizable fungi are mushrooms or toadstools. And some of this group can be really quite toxic, and this group commonly uses sexual reproduction to reproduce. There's also the Ascomycota, which are right here. The Ascomycota, these are named for the formation of a sac-like reproductive unit that's also called an ascus. That's A-S-C-U-S, just like the name, Ascomycota. And in the most extreme sizes, you can think of like if you've ever seen puffballs in the forest or in your yard, those giant big ball-shaped fungi. The puffball is the large ascus. Other members of this class that you might be familiar with are morels. They should be coming out here in Pennsylvania pretty soon. I was hoping to find some. I went on a hike the other day, and I was hoping to find some that I could show you for this lecture, but maybe I'll find them later when we're into the ecology lectures, and I'll show you. Yeast are also probably the best known or used fungus from this group. They're used in baking, they're used in brewing, and this is a single-celled fungus which belongs to the Ascomycota. In addition to the 4 recognized classes that I just talked about, there are 2 additional ones that are not included as true fungi by all mycologists. There's the Glomeromycota. These are the oldest, most ancient group of quote-unquote fungi, and they've been recognized by some as fungi. The most notable member of this class, this small class of fungi, are mycorrhiza, which we're going to talk about, and all the members in the Glomeromycota are involved in plant symbiosis. There's also the Microsporidia. These are not considered fungi by all mycologists either. These are single-celled, flagellated fungi, which are intracellular animal parasites. And I have actually published a little bit of research on these because there's one that's a particularly bad infection for bumblebees. So I am not at all a Microsporidian expert, but I did extract Microsporidian DNA from pinned museum specimens of bumblebees to see how long this Microsporidian parasite, which is Nosema bombi, these are some pictures of it inside of bumblebee tissue here, to see how long that this Microsporidian Sporidium parasite has been present in bumblebees in North America. So I've done a little bit of research on this group that's not actually considered fungi by some people. Some common types of fungi that you might be familiar with. You're probably all familiar with yeast if you've ever eaten a piece of bread, or, well, I guess none of you are 21, so you shouldn't be drinking beer yet. But there are other like fermented non-alcoholic beverages. A lot of those are fermented with yeast. There's also this really gross picture of foot fungus that you might have experienced living in college dorms. You should always wear flip-flops if you shower in a college dorm because you might get athlete's foot. It's really gross. If you've ever left out a piece of bread too long or some other food, you might have seen bread molds or slime molds. And then if you've ever gone on a hike out, a walk out here, particularly in Pennsylvania where it's really wet, you can see mushroom caps, toadstools, puffball fungi, and then shelf fungus hanging off of trees. So these are just some common ones you might be familiar with. So let's talk a little bit about fungal structures. We're going to talk first about the hyphae. Hypha is a single. If you've ever taken Latin, you'll know this is a feminine word, so the plural would be hyphae with ae at the end. This is the most basic structural unit of a fungus, and these are filaments of the fungal cells, which will either be joined end to end to form long filaments, or will form branch sections of the cells. Hyphae are formed by individual fungal cells which are attached together, as you can see here, but the cells are not completely separated. And what that means is that the individual cells are joined together by small holes in the membrane called septum or septa. So this is kind of like the septum that's in your nose, where we have an opening at the end, except this one's an even more opening in this bridge between the cells. So things can flow back and forth between cells in these hyphae. What this means is that all of the cells of the fungus will have a continuous cytoplasm, and this is really important because it allows for the sharing of materials and signals between cells. So if you've ever wondered why you can mow your grass one day and come back the next and already have mushrooms popping up, this is because of the shared cytoplasm between the different cells. The shared cytoplasm that they have allows for very rapid movement of nutrients to the hyphae to the end to allow for very rapid growth, and that's why you can have mushrooms popping up just a day later after you cut them all down with a lawnmower. You can also have mycelium. For most fungi, the hyphae are very small and only visible microscopically, but there are quite often fungi that will bunch together the hyphae to form large structures called mycelium. So this is a huge mass connection of hyphae together. So hyphae group together to form mycelium. This mass connection of the hyphae is going to form the visible portion of the fungus. When the fungus interweaves the hyphae, this will form the reproductive structures of the fungus. So if it's interwoven, those will form the reproductive structures. And as I talked about already, the rapid expansion of the hyphae, because they have this shared cytoplasm, means that there will also be very rapid expansion of the mycelium too, because the mycelium is made up of hyphae. Oh, and the plural, this is a neuter word with if you're thinking about your Latin declensions. So a plural of mycelium would be mycelia with an A at the end. So let's talk a little bit about the cellular features of fungi. Fungi are eukaryotic cells, so they'll show actually more features in common with animals than with plant cells, which is maybe counterintuitive to the way we think about them because they kind of look like plants, but they actually share more in common with animals than plants. Like all eukaryotic cells that you've learned about in GenBio 1, they'll contain DNA inside a nucleus, and they'll contain internal organelles which perform the functions of the cell. Unlike plant cells, these cells do not contain chloroplasts, and as we'll see, this means fungi are heterotrophic organisms. Most of the fungal cells will be haploid. What that means is that the cells will only have one copy of each chromosome, and as we're going to see later, this has some effects on reproduction. They also have cell walls, which makes them different from animal cells. The cell walls that fungi have, which you might remember from a lab when we worked with yeast, their cell walls are made of chitin, which is a modified sugar molecule that you find in a lot of organisms because it's very has a high structural integrity, so it's really great for making rigid structures. It's actually what insects' exoskeletons are made out of, so the cell walls of fungi are made out of chitin too. This is the same material that's used by insects in the formation of the Oh, I just said that. Okay, I should read my own dang notes. Okay, because this material that makes up the cell wall is more similar to the carbohydrates used by animals than cellulose, which is used by plants, that means that they can be used as a means of making the fungal cells closer to animals than plants. So that chitin that you don't see in plants also indicates that they're more closely related to animals than plants. They also have a nucleus structure, so fungal cells will be in classes in one of two cell types based on the number of nuclei that are present in the cells. So they can be monokaryotic, which is one nucleus present in the cell, and this will be the structure of most of the cells in the hyphae. And then you can have dikaryotic, which is two nuclei present in the cell, and these will act as independent units, which will express different genes, have a unique regulation. So you can basically think of these cells as having gone through the M phase of the cell cycle, but haven't completed cell cytokinesis. So basically, dikaryotic are just cells that have two nuclei, but they just didn't finish that last step of actually becoming two independent cells. These dikaryotic, these are generally the most active cells and are found in the end of the hyphae where cell division primarily occurs. If you've got double the nuclei, double the genomes, you can have double the gene expression, and so they're able to be more active than monokaryotic cells. So let's talk about how fungi reproduce. The reproductive cycle of fungi can be both sexual and asexual because most of the cells are haploid. This is going to affect when meiosis and mitosis occur during the life cycle and how the fungi are spread. The reproductive structures of the fungi, you can think of these as the caps of the mushrooms or the puff that you get from a puffball. This is a fungus that's spreading its spores into the environment. On the microscopic level, some of the fungi for these fruiting bodies are at a much smaller scale. This is a picture of bread mold. What was I going to say about? Oh, right, bread mold. You can see the formation of the fruiting bodies that here. The reproductive tissues of fungi will lack the holes or the septa, which join the other regions of the fungi into one piece. And what this means is that they are not directly connected to the cytoplasm or the rest of the cells. And this means the cells can become detached to spread the fungus around. So it's important that they are not connected to the rest of it so that they can disperse away from the parent. In fact, these cells will form spores, which are the mechanism by which the cells will be spread. So a lot of people have allergies or sometimes allergic to fungal spores. These are the reproductive structures that are spread by fungi. So when we talk about the formation of spores, we're going to think about the zygomycota. We're going to talk specifically about them, but other fungi are going to have similar but unique structures. But right now we're just thinking about the zygomycota. In asexual reproduction in these fungi, the fungi will form a reproductive structure called the sporangium. That sporangium will form the spores by means of mitosis. And remember that most of the cells of the fungi are haploid, so inside the reproductive tissue will form the spores, which can be released. And then for sexual reproduction, as I talked about before, This method is different than what's used by plants and animals because it will mix the genetic material from two individuals, and then this will still be considered sexual reproduction. This starts when the mating strands, the special hyphae in the fungi, from two different fungi will meet as they are growing. So as you can see, that's just two cells meeting and joining their genetic material. It's a very, very rudimentary means of sexual reproduction. If the two cells that meet each other are compatible, and actually in fungi they don't even have to be the same species. Sometimes they can be different species, which makes it really hard to study the genetics of fungi because they will just mate with other species all the time. But for the most part, the thing that makes two cells compatible is that they are the same species. Then the two strands will fuse, and that initially forming a dikaryotic cell. Then the nuclei of these cells will fuse through a process called karyogamy. I'll spell that out for you. That's Karyogamy, karyogamy. And the new diploid cell which is formed will be referred to as the zygosporangium that you can see here. So that word, you should think about the zygote in animals. This is kind of analogous to that. The cells, after they form the zygosporangium, will begin to divide via meiosis, which will result in the growth of a new mating strand, which will have different genetic material than the original because it's now got two different individuals' genetic material inside of it. That new strand can now grow and undergo the process of spore formation and continue the cycle all over again. And as I mentioned before, this is the method by which the zygomycota, specifically you're looking at this process in bread molds here. This is how they undergo sexual reproduction. And although there may be different structures, the basidium in mushrooms and the ascus in ascomycota, the process of sexual reproduction is pretty similar in these classes too. So what's so special about the spores that are formed by fungi? Each spore can form a completely new individual. There's actually no need for it to meet another cell before growth of the organism can start. They are very small, and this is useful to the fungus because this means they're really easily dispersed by the wind, and they can travel all over the place, which means, like, in terms of the fungus that spread, that's really damaging to amphibian populations. It's really bad news that it can spread quickly, but it's good news for the fungus. It means they can also get into the air and into our noses and make us sneeze. If you have a mold allergy, you're probably allergic to those mold spores. And they can travel really large distances. These spores are really durable, and they can survive for a really long time and still form a new individual. So if you think about the yeast that you might buy in the store to make bread, you buy it in the store as either freeze-dried spores or in blocks that are in the fridge. There's no need for special preservation because the spores of these yeast are really tough and able to survive harsh conditions for a long time. Come on, next slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about fungal ecology. All fungi are heterotrophs, which means they will require their nutrients to be supplied from other individuals. They're not able to make their own material, like some animal cells. Unlike animal cells or protists, which are able to use intracellular digestive processes, fungi will deposit their food by the secretion of digestion enzymes, which will break down the food, and this will then be absorbed as the simple components of the food. So some of the fungi are parasitic, which means that they'll allow the host cells or the organisms that they're invading to break down the diet, and then they'll use the components which are available. And I'll show you, this is one of my favorite parasitic fungi that lives inside of ants. The problem with this, though, is that it then robs the material from the host organisms, and they may eventually kill the host. A lot of parasitic fungi do eventually kill their host. Most of the fungi that you're familiar with will grow on trees, either living or dead. So here's a picture of a shelf fungus. And in fact, in the forest, the fungi are one of the major organisms that are responsible for the decomposition of dead trees and leaves. And they have really important roles in ecosystems in nutrient cycling the dead forest material in the forest so that it can then be made available to the other plants that are growing there. One of the main reasons for this ability to digest the lignin in the cell walls that we've talked about in plants, that's a really, really tough carbohydrate that's hard to break down, is that lignin is one of the main components of the cell walls in the sclerenchyma cells and is found in particularly high concentrations in the inner cells of the trees. This form of the cell wall that's indigestible by most animals and is not a good food source. However, fungi make special enzymes that allow them to break down the lignin and digest the trees. So that's why fungi are so good at breaking down trees and other organisms are not, is because they make a special enzyme that helps them break down that really tough lignin that you find in the sclerenchyma cells in trees. Some fungi are predators in that they're able to infect and digest small animals. So they're a parasite is basically a form of a predator because it's killing and eating another organism. And so what's shown here is a fungus called cordyceps fungus. And you'll notice the reproductive structure that's coming out of its head. I'll talk a little bit more about those on the next slide. For the fungi which live on the trees, this will occur too for small insects and worms which will grow in the tree. And this is a really important source of nitrogen, amino acids, and nucleic acids for the fungi is to eat animals. They're actually very nutritious for them. You all know I'm an entomologist, so I'm very fascinated by anything involving insects, and so I'm a really big fan of cordyceps fungi, and I thought I'd just include a slide here. I have a colleague of mine is a amazing, probably the world's best insect photographer is Alex Wild. Here's a link to his website. And these are just some pictures he's taken of cordyceps fungi infecting lots of different insects. So what these cordyceps fungi do is that they infect the insides of the insect, and then they kind of take over control of their brain, and they make them climb up high onto plants, and then at least in the ones that infect ants, they have them bite down on a leaf vein so that through the insect they're still getting access to nutrition from a plant by taking over its brain and having it climb up a tree and bite onto a leaf vein so that it gets nutrition. And then it kind of slowly digests the insect from the inside out, and then it forms these fruiting bodies that come out. And the reason they have them climb up high is so that then those get eaten by birds that eat the fungi and then deposit the fungi around, and that's how they disperse. So they are really, really cool parasites. Now let's talk a little bit about some symbiotic fungi. Some fungi have developed a symbiotic relationship with the plants that they live on. Both organisms in symbioses benefit from this interaction. We've already talked about mycorrhizae, which are the fungus that grow around the roots of many plants. And what they do, as a reminder, is that the plants will provide nutrients to the fungus, and in turn the fungus will act to increase the surface area of the roots to allow for more efficient water absorption. The most complex example is the fungus that grows in the dens of leafcutter ants that you can see here. This fungus provides the ants with the ability to break down the carbohydrates that are in the leaf cells, which is in most forms this is cellulose. Cellulose cannot be digested by the ants. So the ant will then collect leaves. they'll snip off little pieces of leaves. They bring them back to their nest into their specific fungus gardens. Then they build a material on which that fungus can grow. They chew on the leaves, and then the ants will provide moisture and sugars to attract the fungus. And then once the fungus starts to grow on the leaves, the fungi break down the leaves, and the ants will eat the fungi. So that's a good energy source for the ants. So these ants actually garden these fungi, and some species of leafcutter ants in the queens, when they form queens in a colony cycle, they actually have a special pocket on the back of their backs that they've evolved for holding a little piece of fungi, so that they can bring it with them to start their new fungus gardens in the new colonies that they start. Really, really cool example of coevolution and symbiosis. Lichens, that like the one I showed you in the video at the beginning, are another symbiotic relationship. Lichens are able to grow on rocks and other non-habitable soils, like the stone that's in my backyard, because of the interaction between the fungus and a photosynthetic organism which has developed as part of the lichen. So most of what is visible on the surface of the organism is the fungus, which will act to grow with the photosynthetic bacteria, the cyanobacteria, or the algae that's inside the fungus. The photosynthetic organism will provide energy and sugars for the fungus to grow, and the fungus will protect the photosynthetic organism and provide moisture for its growth. This type of relationship has allowed the lichens to grow in some of the most harsh conditions on Earth. Like, you can even find these in the desert, which is really crazy. And they are the primary growing organism in tundra regions, where the permafrost layer under the soil prevents the growth of roots. So a lot of organisms that grow in the tundra, like any plants that grow in tundra regions, are generally very short and small because they can't dig their roots very low. And because of the harsh climate conditions, lichens are usually the most common photosynthetic organisms in tundra regions. Additionally, lichens are able to function as one of the first organisms to grow in an area that's recently undergone a disaster, such as like a forest fire. Lichens are the ones that will begin the process of growth and recolonization in those areas that have been destroyed. So they are really, really cool. Let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of a lichen. So how does this symbiotic relationship work? The lichen is like a fungus sandwich with the photosynthetic organisms growing in the upper layer inside of the bread of the sandwich, which is the fungus. So you can kind of think of the fungus as like the two layers of bread, and then in the middle kind of grows this photosynthetic layer of the algae or the cyanobacteria. The upper layer of the fungus will protect the photosynthetic organism from the harsh conditions of whatever environment they're growing in, but it's thin enough to allow the light to pass through so that these organisms can still photosynthesize. There's a large open space inside the lichen, and this will be to allow for airflow for the organisms to breathe, or it might be a location where they'll trap water if the photosynthetic organism that's inside there is an algae. So that's what this loose layer is for, is either for airflow or for trapping water. And then below this space will be a layer of fungus that's attached this whole structure to the supporting material, which could be simply just like a rock in my backyard. The interaction of the fungus and the photosynthetic organisms is really close. The fungus is able to grow into the cell wall of the other organism, but it generally doesn't penetrate the cell membrane because they don't want to harm that organism, because that organism is providing nutrition for them. So the lichen is providing a safe housing area and perhaps even water for the cyanobacteria or the algae that's growing inside of it, and in return, the cyanobacteria, the algae, via photosynthesis provides nutrition to the fungus. But not all fungi are good. fungi can cause several problems for human health. For even the most simple fungal infections, anybody who's immune compromised may succumb to a simple infection like athlete's foot. Can cause severe health problems if they're immunocompromised, like if they have AIDS and their immune system isn't able to deal with that fungus. It could be potentially fatal to them. In addition to potential health problems, the growth of molds or other fungi on stores of food may lead to significant losses for farmers who are growing those food. One example of a fungus that infects crops is ergot. This can infect grain stores, and this fungus produces alkaloid chemicals that may have hallucinogenic effects. And the consumption of these infected grains in New England is thought to be one of the causes that the witches were burned at the stake in the Salem witch trials. So they think that the hallucinogenic effects of this ergot fungus that grew on the grains that people were eating in New England caused them to have hallucinations and led to the Salem witch trials. So fungus might have been involved in the Salem witch trials. Isn't that crazy? Recently, the yeast candida, which is able to grow inside your digestive tract, is thought to be one of the leading causes for irritable bowel syndrome and among a bunch of other common health problems. So fungus can be really detrimental to human health. Some of the effects that they can have on plants. I forgot to mention aflatoxins. Aflatoxins are also produced by a fungus, and these may be aided by insect pests. One in particular that I know of is May Berenbaum at the University of Illinois. When I was there, had a couple projects working on some insects that infested almond crops, and while they infested it, the poop that they would leave behind would cause fungi to grow inside those almonds, and those fungi would produce aflatoxins, which can cause cancer and can even be neurodegenerative. So fungi can also make some really terrible toxins for human health if they infect the things that we eat. Some other effects on plants is that more significant effects on growth can be seen from fungi on plants. The growth of fungi on the plants can lead to the death of the plants, which can have significant effects such as deforestation and crop destruction. In the picture that you see, it shows the effect of fungus on different regions of a forest in Montana. And it's worth noting that each patch that you see circled in this picture is the result of a single fungus that has spread. It's one huge fungus, and it's one of the largest organisms on Earth. And it can sometimes even be bigger than a large blue whale. So fungi can be very detrimental to humans and to plants and other animals. Let's also talk a little bit about toxic mushrooms. Some of the most toxic organisms on Earth are fungi. As with plants, these toxins are usually made as secondary metabolites. So they may act to protect the fungi, or they may be involved in an active mechanism that the fungus uses to kill prey. As I talked about before, the fungus will use small worms and other organisms as a source of nitrogen, but since the fungus doesn't move, it's not able to stop the prey to digest it, so it uses these toxins instead to kill them so that it then can digest them. So it releases these toxins into the soil or wherever it's growing. Some of these can be power enough to be able to be harmful to humans. One example of this is the death cap mushroom. It contains a toxin that's able to bind to the protein actin. Actin, as you probably know from Gen Bio 1, is one of the most common proteins in humans. It's in all of our muscle cells. So what it does is it stops digestion and can eventually stop the heart from beating and stop you from breathing. So don't eat a death cap mushroom. Another one of these toxins will target the nervous system, and that means it can affect the perception of the person that it's inside of, and this will result in a hallucinogenic effect of certain types of mushrooms. So the ergot that we talked about on the previous slide is one example. And these, as I already said, the reason that these mushrooms have these toxins is that they're generally meant as a means to stop the prey that they're going to eat and digest from moving. And so they also can have the same effect in humans. But not all fungi are bad. Some of them are very good. Mushrooms are a really good solid food source for many different areas. And in fact, they can be a very, very good and nutritious food source because the cell walls are not made of cellulose like a plant. That means that they're generally very easy to digest, and they are very nutritious food sources because they can be really easy to digest. Some of them are considered delicacies. One of my all-time favorites are truffles, even though I don't know if I've ever actually had an actual truffle because they're thousands of dollars for a single mushroom or even hundreds of dollars. I usually buy the artificial flavoring that tastes like truffles. That is a lot cheaper. They'll sell for hundreds of dollars per ounce, and that's truffles. Another one that's a lot cheaper and is still delicious is corn smut or huitlacoche. I actually have a jar of this salsa in my fridge right now. I serve salsa and chips and dip in my ecology class with huitlacoche in it every year, so that people can try one of these examples of a parasite. I think it's really delicious. It's not a smoked mushroom. Corn smut's not a really nice name. I like the Mexican name, huitlacoche. It's got like a smoky flavor, even though it's not a smoked mushroom. I really enjoy it, and I really like it in quesadillas. If we come back, I'll have when we come back to campus, I'll email all of you, and we'll have a food tasting of like cordyceps tea and huitlacoche salsa and a bunch of stuff, just because I would love to see y'all again, all in one place. But anyway, it's also called corn smut, and it's a really common dish in Mexico and Central America. Yeast, another type of fungus, which is commonly used in baking and brewing. We've brought it up before. It can also grow in anaerobic conditions, and when it grows in anaerobic conditions without oxygen, they'll make alcohol, which will become all the favorite beverages that at least people over 21 are depending on in this quarantine time. Also in these same conditions, when the CO2 is released by the yeast, this can be trapped inside the gluten fibers, and this is what leads to the rising of dough. In bread is the carbon dioxide that's released by the yeast. And then finally, one of the most helpful fungi probably in the world to humans was the identification of the antibiotic penicillin, which is made by fungi. And there have been a wide variety of additional chemicals with similar properties which have been found in fungi. Penicillin, for example, is something that fungi develop as a form of protection, and now it is really, really important antibiotic for human health. So fungi can be very, very dangerous, but also very, very good for human health and extremely delicious. So that's it. Now we're going to get into ecology, so stay tuned on my YouTube channel for the next lecture where we get into my forte, ecology. Bye-bye!